They have lived in the same land for thousands of years. Their language is unlike any other on Earth. And their DNA, it holds secrets that have baffled scientists for centuries. The Basques are not a lost civilization or a forgotten tribe. They are very much alive. But what makes them so unique? What is hidden within their genetic code that sets them apart from the rest of Europe? This mystery has driven researchers to analyze ancient remains, map out genetic markers, and trace migrations dating back thousands of years. And what they found? It changed everything. For a long time, people thought the Basques were the last pure descendants of Europe's first hunter-gatherers, untouched by the waves of migration that shaped the rest of the continent. Others speculated that they came from North Africa, or even the Caucasus. But cutting-edge genetic studies have shattered these myths. DNA evidence now reveals a far more fascinating truth. The Basques are not some separate species of Europeans, but rather a time capsule, a living snapshot of what Europe looked like thousands of years ago, frozen in genetic isolation. Ancient DNA extracted from human remains in northern Spain tells us that the story of the Basques begins with early farmers who arrived in the Iberian Peninsula about 7,000 years ago. These Neolithic settlers mixed with the local hunter-gatherers, forming a population that would become the genetic foundation of the Basques. But here's where things get interesting. While the rest of Europe continued to evolve through centuries of migration, conquest, and cultural shifts, something strange happened to the Basques. Or rather, nothing happened. Unlike their neighbors in Spain and France, the Basques remain genetically untouched by the major migration waves that reshaped Europe. The arrival of Indo-European steppe warriors, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the Islamic expansion into Iberia. None of these events left any significant genetic impact on the Basques. It's as if time simply stood still for them. But why? The answer might lie in their language. Euskara, the Basque language, is an enigma. It is the only surviving pre-Indo-European language in Western Europe, and it has no known relatives. Some researchers believe that this linguistic barrier played a critical role in their genetic isolation. If the Basques couldn't communicate with incoming populations, they couldn't mix with them either. Even within the Basque country itself, different dialects may have further divided communities, preserving their ancient genetic structure. But what does their DNA actually look like? That's where things get even more fascinating. The Basques carry an extremely high frequency of a Y chromosome lineage, known as R1b DF27. This marker is found in Western Europe, but nowhere is it as dominant as in the Basque country. It's a genetic signature that links them to the Bronze Age, but also raises an even bigger question. If the Basques carry Indo-European DNA, why didn't they adopt Indo-European languages like everyone else? Scientists are still trying to unravel this paradox. At the same time, their mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, connects them to Europe's ancient hunter-gatherers. This means that while Basque paternal lineage shows signs of migration, their maternal lineage remained deeply rooted in the land. It's a complex and unique genetic tapestry that tells a story of both movement and isolation, of continuity and resistance to change. This is what makes the Basques so unique. They are not some lost tribe, nor are they an entirely separate branch of humanity. They are living proof of Europe's ancient past, a people who have carried their genetic identity through thousands of years, despite the forces of history pushing against them. And this is just the beginning. For centuries, the Basques have been a mystery wrapped in a riddle. They don't look different from their Spanish or French neighbors, yet their DNA tells a story that no other European population shares. Their language has no connection to any other known tongue. Their culture has remained distinct despite being surrounded by some of the most powerful empires in history. But where did they come from? And why are they so different? The search for Basque origins has led to some of the most bizarre theories in history. Some once believed they were the last remnants of an ancient race that lived in Europe before anyone else. Others suggested they were refugees from Atlantis, survivors of a lost civilization, swallowed by the sea. More scientifically minded researchers proposed they came from North Africa, or even the Caucasus Mountains, thousands of miles away. But in the last few decades, science has given us an answer, and it's far more fascinating than fiction. DNA extracted from ancient human remains in Iberia has helped trace the Basques' lineage. It turns out they are not outsiders. They are deeply European, with roots that go back to some of the first farmers who arrived in Spain around 7,000 years ago. These early agriculturalists, originally from Anatolia, mixed with local Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. This blend of farming settlers and indigenous Europeans formed the foundation of what would eventually become the Basque people. But here's where things get strange. After this initial mixing, something happened that made the Basques different from everyone else in Europe. The rest of the continent went through massive waves of migration. Indo-European warriors from the steppes spread across the land, shaping cultures and languages. Later, the Romans expanded their empire, followed by the Moors, the Franks, and countless other groups. But the Basques, they resisted. They stayed isolated. Some historians believe that the geography of the Basque country, its rugged mountains and deep valleys, helped shield them from outside influence. Others think that their cultural traditions and strong sense of identity made them less likely to integrate with outsiders. But one of the most intriguing explanations is their language. Euskara is one of the few languages in the world with no known relatives. If newcomers couldn't speak it, they couldn't assimilate. By the time of the Iron Age, around 2,500 years ago, the Basques had already set themselves apart from the rest of Iberia. Studies show that while their Spanish and French neighbors absorbed genes from Romans, Visigoths, and Moors, the Basques remained largely untouched. They were not a lost people or an ancient anomaly. They were simply an unbroken link to Europe's distant past. Today, the mystery of Basque origins isn't as much about where they came from, but how they managed to remain so distinct. They are not a relic of the Stone Age, but rather a testament to endurance, a culture, and a people that held on to their identity when the rest of the world changed around them. For years, people speculated that the Basques were an ancient mystery, an isolated group untouched by time. But modern science has uncovered something even more fascinating. Their DNA holds a secret, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about human migration and survival. For centuries, theories about Basque origins ranged from the bizarre to the plausible. Some believed they were the last survivors of Europe's first inhabitants, while others thought they might have migrated from distant lands. But the truth, it's written in their genes. When scientists analyzed ancient DNA from human remains in Spain, they found something extraordinary. The Basques are not a separate species of Europeans. They are a living fossil of Europe's past. Their ancestry traces back to the first Neolithic farmers, who arrived in the Iberian Peninsula about 7,000 years ago. These settlers, originally from Anatolia, mixed with local Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. This combination of early farmers and indigenous people formed the genetic foundation of what would later become the Basques. But then something strange happened. While the rest of Europe went through waves of migration, cultural shifts, and genetic mixing, the Basques remained almost untouched. The Indo-Europeans, who spread their languages and genes across the continent, barely left a mark on them. Later, when Rome conquered much of Europe, the Basques resisted. Even when the Moors ruled Spain for centuries, their genetic influence didn't reach the Basque population. This level of isolation is almost unheard of in human history. It's as if the Basques hit a genetic pause button thousands of years ago. But how? Scientists believe that geography played a role. Their mountainous homeland acted as a natural barrier. But even more important was their language. Euskara is unlike any other language in the world. If newcomers couldn't speak it, they couldn't integrate. Over time, this kept the Basque population distinct, their DNA preserved like a time capsule. Modern studies reveal that the Basques have an unusually high frequency of a Y chromosome lineage called R1b DF27. This marker is found in parts of Western Europe, but nowhere else is it as dominant as in the Basque country. It links them to Bronze Age migrations. Yet, unlike other R1b populations, they never adopted Indo-European languages. This genetic paradox has left scientists with more questions than answers. At the same time, their mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through mothers, connects them to Europe's ancient hunter-gatherers. This means that while Basque men may have mixed with outside groups during the early Bronze Age, Basque women carried forward a deep, unbroken lineage that reaches back thousands of years. So what does this all mean? It means that the Basques are not an isolated anomaly or a lost civilization. They are a window into Europe's distant past, a group that has held onto their genetic identity for millennia. Their DNA is proof that, in a world of constant change, some threads of history remain unbroken. It's one of the strangest mysteries in human history. In a world where languages evolve, merge, and disappear, one language has remained an island, unchanged, unmoved, and completely unrelated to any other on Earth. It's called Euskara, the language of the Basques. And for centuries, it has done something extraordinary. It has preserved not just a culture, but an entire genetic legacy. Linguists have searched for connections between Euskara and other languages, but they've come up empty. It is not related to Spanish, French, or any Indo-European tongue. Some have suggested links to ancient Iberian, the Caucasus, or even languages from North Africa. But DNA tells a different story, one that reveals just how powerful language can be in shaping human history. Scientists now believe that Euskara acted as a genetic barrier. While the rest of Europe absorbed waves of migration from Indo-European warriors, Roman legions, and later Muslim conquerors, the Basques remained largely untouched. And the key to their isolation wasn't just their geography. It was their language. Imagine arriving in a land where no one speaks a language even remotely similar to your own. No shared roots, no common words. Communication breaks down. Integration becomes difficult, if not impossible. This is exactly what happened when foreign groups entered the Basque region. Over time, those who couldn't speak Euskara found it harder to mix with the Basques, and this helped preserve both their culture and their genetics. Even within the Basque country itself, dialects created further divisions. Until the 20th century, Euskara had multiple variations, some so different that people from neighboring villages struggled to understand each other. This may have reinforced smaller, isolated gene pools within the Basque population, keeping their genetic structure even more distinct. But why did Euskara survive when so many other ancient languages disappeared? The answer may lie in the Basques' deep cultural identity. Unlike many other European groups, they resisted external influence for thousands of years. They weren't just holding on to their traditions. They were holding on to their way of life. And their language was the heart of it all. Today, Euskara remains one of the oldest spoken languages in Europe, a linguistic fossil from a time before Latin, Greek, or even Celtic languages dominated the continent. It has withstood empires, wars, and the rise of modern nations. But beyond words and grammar, it tells a far greater story, one of survival, identity, and a people whose DNA has remained as unique as their language. At first glance, the Basques don't seem different from their Spanish or French neighbors. But hidden within their DNA is something extraordinary, something that makes them unlike any other people in Europe. Their genetic code holds secrets that scientists are only now beginning to understand. But what exactly makes Basque DNA so unique? It all comes down to one thing: isolation. While most European populations experienced repeated waves of migration, the Basques remained genetically untouched for thousands of years. Their DNA is like a time capsule, preserving ancient genetic markers that have been lost in other groups. One of the biggest clues to their uniqueness is found in their Y chromosome DNA, passed down through the male line. The Basques have an extremely high frequency of a genetic marker called R1b DF27, a branch of the R1b haplogroup, which is common across Western Europe. But here's the mystery. The R1b lineage is strongly linked to Indo-European migrations, yet the Basques never adopted an Indo-European language. This contradiction has baffled scientists for years. How can their DNA show evidence of the same migrations that shaped the rest of Europe, yet their culture and language remain completely distinct? The answer may lie in how those migrations played out in the Basque region. While the genetic influence of Indo-European steppe warriors may have reached Basque men through the paternal line, the population as a whole resisted cultural assimilation. Their language, Euskara, acted as a shield, preventing them from fully integrating with outside groups. But their uniqueness isn't just in their Y DNA. The Basques also carry distinct mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is inherited through the maternal line. This connects them to Europe's ancient hunter-gatherers, suggesting that, while the male lineage may have absorbed some outside influences, Basque women carried an unbroken genetic legacy, stretching back thousands of years. What's even more fascinating is that the Basques share some genetic similarities with other isolated populations. For example, their genetic patterns have been compared to the Sardinians, another European group with a unique history of isolation. But unlike Sardinians, the Basques have preserved not just their genes, but an entirely separate linguistic and cultural identity. Modern studies have confirmed that Basque DNA has remained distinct since at least the Iron Age, around 2,500 years ago. While the rest of the Iberian Peninsula saw genetic mixing from Roman, Moorish, and other migrations, the Basques remain genetically stable. This means that their DNA represents one of the purest links to ancient Europe, an unbroken genetic thread leading back to the early farmers and hunter-gatherers who first settled the region. So what makes Basque DNA so unique? It's not just a single genetic marker or an unusual mutation. It's the result of thousands of years of resistance to change, a perfect storm of isolation, cultural strength, and linguistic separation. The Basques aren't just a people. They are a living window into Europe's deep past, carrying the genes of a time long before nations, empires, or even written history. For thousands of years, the Basques remained apart from the rest of Europe. Their isolation preserved their culture, their language, and their DNA. But was this separation a blessing or a curse? On one hand, their isolation is what makes them so unique. While the rest of Europe was shaped by waves of migration, Indo-Europeans, Romans, Moors, the Basques resisted change. They held onto their traditions, their genetic identity, and their ancient language, Euskara, while others adapted and assimilated. Because of this, scientists today can study them like a time capsule of ancient Europe, a direct link to the continent's earliest inhabitants. But there's a downside to this isolation, one that's hidden in their genes. When a population remains genetically distinct for too long, it can lead to something called the founder effect. This happens when a small group of people pass down the same genetic traits for generations, limiting diversity. Over time, this can increase the risk of inherited diseases. And that's exactly what has happened in the Basque population. Certain genetic disorders, like a rare form of Parkinson's disease called Dardarin, from the Basque word for trembling, are more common among Basques than in the rest of Europe. Studies have also found a higher prevalence of some blood disorders, like hemophilia, and certain types of anemia. These conditions are not caused by an outside factor, but rather by centuries of genetic isolation. But while this might seem like a disadvantage, it has also led to scientific breakthroughs. Researchers studying Basque genetics have been able to map out unique disease markers, leading to better treatments, not just for Basques, but for people around the world. By understanding how isolation affects genetic health, scientists can develop new ways to treat inherited diseases in other populations, too. So, was isolation a blessing or a curse? The answer is both. It preserved the Basques' language, culture, and unique genetic identity, making them one of the most fascinating people in the world. But it also came at a cost, one that can still be seen in their DNA today. Their story is a powerful reminder that history doesn't just shape nations, it shapes our very genes. 4,500 years ago, a powerful new group arrived in Europe. They were warriors, herders, and conquerors, riding in on horseback from the vast steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia. They didn't just bring new weapons and technology. They brought something even more powerful: their genes and their language. These were the Indo-Europeans, the ancestors of the Celts, the Germans, the Slavs, and even the Romans. They reshaped the genetic and cultural landscape of Europe. But there was one group they barely touched: the Basques. This is one of the greatest mysteries in European history. The Indo-European migrations left a massive impact almost everywhere they went. They didn't just spread their genes, they spread their languages, replacing older tongues with new ones. Almost every major language spoken in Europe today, from Spanish to English, from Russian to Greek, can be traced back to these steppe invaders. But the Basques, they kept their own language. Their identity remained intact. Yet, here's the twist. Genetic studies show that the Basques do have steppe ancestry. Their Y chromosome, particularly the R1b haplogroup, is heavily linked to the Indo-European expansion. This means that steppe men did enter the Basque region. But despite this genetic influence, the Basques never adopted Indo-European culture or language. How is that possible? One explanation is geography. The Basque region is filled with rugged mountains and deep valleys, perfect for resisting invasion. Unlike the open plains of France or Germany, where Indo-European cultures easily spread, the Basque homeland acted as a natural fortress. But geography alone isn't enough to explain it. After all, the Indo-Europeans conquered the Alps, the British Isles, and even parts of the Middle East. So why not the Basques? The answer might be found in their language. Euskara is completely unrelated to Indo-European languages. Unlike Celtic, Latin, or Germanic tongues, it doesn't share common roots with the invader's speech. And language is one of the strongest barriers to assimilation. When the Indo-Europeans spread across Europe, they mixed with local populations, but their languages took over. But in the Basque country, communication was nearly impossible. Without a common language, cultural integration was slow, if it happened at all. Another theory suggests that the Basques were already an organized society by the time the Indo-Europeans arrived. If they had strong traditions, social structures, and a deep-rooted identity, it would have been harder for outside influences to take hold. Instead of being absorbed into the Indo-European world, the Basques resisted, maintaining their way of life despite the changing world around them. Whatever the reason, the Basques remained different. They absorbed just enough genetic material from the Indo-European expansions to show up in DNA tests, but not enough to change who they were. Today, they stand as a rare example of a pre-Indo-European people, a living link to the world before steppe migrations reshaped Europe. 2,500 years ago, the world was changing. The Iron Age had brought powerful new civilizations to Europe. The Celts roamed the west, the Greeks and Phoenicians ruled the seas, and Rome was rising. Cultures mixed, languages spread, and genetic barriers broke down. But in one small corner of the continent, time seemed to stop. While the rest of Europe transformed, the Basques remained frozen in history. Genetic studies show that the Basque population became distinct around 2,500 years ago, during the Iron Age. Before that, they had much in common with their Iberian neighbors. But something happened during this period that set them apart, something that isolated them genetically, culturally, and linguistically from the rest of the continent. The key to this isolation may have been geography and resilience. The Basques lived in a mountainous region filled with rugged terrain, deep valleys, and natural barriers. This made large-scale invasions difficult. While the Celts and Romans expanded across most of Europe, the Basque homeland was not an easy target. But resistance wasn't just about mountains. It was about identity. Unlike other Iberian tribes, the Basques refused to adopt new customs, new languages, or new ruling systems. Their culture was strong enough to withstand the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful forces in history. When the Romans arrived in Iberia, they changed everything. They built cities, roads, and fortresses. They introduced Latin, which eventually evolved into Spanish, Portuguese, and French. But the Basques, they didn't change. Unlike their neighbors, they never fully integrated into Roman culture. Their language, Euskara, remained untouched by Latin influence, something almost unheard of in Western Europe. Even after the fall of Rome, the Basques remained separate. The Visigoths came. The Franks came. Later, the Moors crossed into Spain. Each new wave of conquest left a genetic footprint on Iberia, but not on the Basques. Their DNA remained almost exactly the same as it had been during the Iron Age. This level of continuity is almost unmatched in European history. Most other populations absorbed new migrations, new languages, and new cultures. But the Basques held firm. Their story isn't just one of survival. It's a story of resistance. They weren't just preserving their past. They were defying history. For centuries, the Basques have been wrapped in myth and mystery. Some claimed they were the last pure descendants of Europe's first humans. Others believed they came from a lost civilization or even a completely different branch of humanity. But modern science has finally given us answers. And the truth, it's even more fascinating than the myths. For years, one of the most common beliefs was that the Basques were a remnant population of the first hunter-gatherers of Europe, untouched by later migrations. But genetic research has completely shattered this idea. Studies of ancient DNA reveal that the Basques are not an isolated relic from the Stone Age. Instead, They are the descendants of early farmers who arrived in Iberia around 7,000 years ago. These farmers mixed with local Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, forming a unique genetic blend that would later define the Basques. But what makes them truly different is what happened next. Around 4,500 years ago, Indo-European steppe migrations swept across Europe, reshaping the genetic and linguistic landscape. In most regions, these steppe warriors replaced local male lineages and introduced new languages that evolved into Spanish, French, German, and most of what is spoken in Europe today. But the Basques resisted. This is where science uncovers one of the biggest paradoxes in Basque history. Their Y chromosome markers show clear evidence of Indo-European influence, specifically the R1b, DF27 lineage, which is dominant in Western Europe. But despite this genetic impact, the Basques never adopted Indo-European languages. Euskara remained intact, untouched by the linguistic changes that shaped the rest of the continent. This means the Basques absorbed steppe DNA, but not steppe culture. Recent studies from Harvard University and UPF Barcelona have pinpointed exactly when the Basques became genetically distinct from their neighbors. It happened around 2,500 years ago, during the Iron Age. Before that, they shared more genetic similarities with other Iberian populations. But after this point, they stopped mixing with outside groups. While Spain and France absorbed genetic influences from Romans, Moors, and Franks, the Basques remained largely untouched. Another major breakthrough came with the discovery that the Basques are not as genetically different from other Europeans as once thought. While they are unique, their genetic makeup still falls within the broader European spectrum. The difference isn't in their origins, but in their long period of isolation. The Basques weren't an ancient, separate race. They were a group that resisted change for thousands of years. Science has also helped explain another key mystery: the connection between language and DNA. Euskara has long been a puzzle for linguists, with no known relatives. But recent genetic studies suggest that language may have played a critical role in the Basques' isolation. If newcomers couldn't speak Euskara, they couldn't integrate. Over generations, this helped preserve not just the language, but also the genetic identity of the Basques. So what do modern discoveries tell us? They reveal that the Basques are not a lost civilization or a prehistoric relic, but something far more compelling: a living bridge between ancient and modern Europe. Their DNA carries the story of early farmers, steppe migrations, and thousands of years of resistance to cultural change. They are not the oldest Europeans, but they might be the most enduring. The Basques are more than just a unique people. They are a living link to our past, a group that has preserved a genetic and cultural identity that most of Europe lost thousands of years ago. But beyond their own history, the Basques teach us something even greater. They reveal the hidden forces that shape civilizations, languages, and even human evolution itself. One of the biggest lessons from Basque history is how migration shapes identity. Thousands of years ago, early farmers from Anatolia arrived in Iberia, mixing with the local hunter-gatherers. This blending of cultures and genetics created the foundation of the Basques. But while other groups continued to evolve through new migrations, the Basques stayed almost unchanged. They remind us that history is not just about movement. It's also about those who resist it. Another lesson comes from their language and isolation. Euskara is one of the last pre-Indo-European languages in Europe, surviving when almost every other ancient tongue disappeared. This shows us how language can act as a genetic and cultural shield. It wasn't just mountains that kept the Basques separate. It was their words, their traditions, and their refusal to assimilate. It proves that culture can be just as powerful as geography in shaping human history. The Basques also teach us about the power of endurance. While Rome, the Moors, and later European empires spread their influence across Iberia, the Basques held firm. They kept their identity through conquest, war, and modernization. In a world where cultures often disappear or merge, the Basques show us that survival isn't just about adapting. It's about knowing what to hold on to. But perhaps the most important lesson is what the Basques reveal about who we are as humans. Their DNA, their language, and their history prove that even in an ever-changing world, some connections to the past remain unbroken. The Basques remind us that the story of humanity is not just about progress. It's also about preservation.